Yeah, let me walk you through what it is.
All right.
So, again, thanks for taking the time out of your busy day. I really
Okay.
appreciate it.
No problem.
So, similar to the last data meeting that we had, just
Yeah.
want to give you an overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to take a look at the student work that they did based on the novel, the excerpt that they did.
Okay.
And we'll compare it to the exemplar that AP has,
Yep.
as well as identify a student exemplar.
Okay.
We'll figure out what we want our students to most focus on by identifying what that gap is.
Okay.
And then go ahead and plan a reteach to identify and address how they can close that gap and move
Okay.
ahead.
Perfect.
Sound good as an overview?
Absolutely.
All right, super. So let's get started. Here's the same packet that
Okay.
you gave me with all the student samples. I just scanned it for sake of ease
Good.
as far as referencing. So before we jump into the work that the scholars did, I just wanted to commend you with a gold star. When I was in the classroom, you had them walk through the key components of what imagery, metaphor, you were using figurative language,
Okay.
and the students were able to use that chart effectively and
Absolutely.
sort the evidence. So it's obvious that you've done a lot of the hard work
Yep.
in instructing them and making the examples relevant. So
Okay.
I think that was great.
Thank you.
Can you speak for a minute about what steps you took for the students to be able to understand those key literary concepts?
Absolutely. So we did a lot of background knowledge on those literary devices first. So what I did was I provided them a list with about 20 to 30 literary devices. I told them to put a star or a little mark next to about 10 of those, and those would be their 10.
So moving ahead to this release passage that we did, let's take a look at what the exemplar is,
Okay.
which is going
Which
to be
one?
at the beginning of the packet. Let's take a look at, I think we should keep the bar high and
Oh,
look
yeah.
at the top one.
Yep,
Do you
I like
agree?
it. I agree.
All right, super. So taking a look at this, I know we're both very familiar with it because we've looked at it many,
Yeah.
many times. It's not new. What I wanted to is, as we're looking through this, keep in mind, what do the students need to know in order to do this,
Yeah.
and what do they want, what are we asking them to show? So on the front page of the packet that I gave you,
Okay.
as we're reading through this, consider, and we're going to fill this out as the next part. The first
Okay.
part is going to analyze the exemplar, but
Yep.
while we're analyzing it, I wanted to give you a framework for that analysis. So think about, for the concept, what's the content the kids need to have?
Okay.
And then think about the show being more procedural. What do we want them to show in the essay? So I'm going to get my phone and just set a timer to
Absolutely.
keep this on. All right. What we can do next is, I think this is so chock full of content, the knowledge that we want our students to show.
Absolutely.
Maybe we can break down exactly what those skills are.
Oh, yeah.
So what we can do, two things I thought. We could take a look at what this rubric says, as well as the demands of the prompt.
Okay. Perfect.
Which one do you want to start with?
Let's do rubric first.
Okay,
Actually, no, I'm sorry. Let's do prompt first and then rubric.
super.
Yeah.
Tell me, from reading the prompt, what you think are the key concepts students need to know?
So the key concepts that the students need to know from the prompt would be the literary devices, or how literary devices are used in the text.
Okay,
They need to know the relationship of women and men in the text. They need to know how to take a stance, right? And then they need to know how to connect literary devices to support the stance that they take. So not merely just saying, hey, this is the literary device that's found in the text, then connect why that use of the literary device was important to what they're arguing in the text.
great. So you turn stance into argument.
Absolutely.
So let's stick with that term of argument, because I think that's more of a powerful skill than a stance.
Yep.
Okay, super. Okay, so based on what this passage is asking, as you mentioned, they have to understand what's happening in the story. What's the
Yes.
situation? They have to be able to use some of those literary devices, and then
Yep.
third is tying those together.
Yes.
Great. Now, let's flip back to the rubric from AP, which is on our front page.
Yep.
Let's take a look and see if there's any other language that we should consider in this number. All right, anything else jump out?
Yes.
That.
Well, students' interpretation, that's argument. Variety of literary devices. Right.
Correct.
Engage through text through apt specific references, that's textual evidence or supporting details if you want to go back to argument. Perspective analysis is apparent, right? So that shifts the writing from summary to argument. And then it goes back to sophisticated analysis.
Okay.
So dig deep into what was said to then connect to the point that they're trying to make.
So we have a lot going on.
Absolutely. Yeah,
There's some heavy demands for
absolutely.
our scholars.
Yes.
So I think what we can do is we'll take two steps. Let's chart what we just talked about. So we
Okay,
have a
perfect.
visual representation, and then we could identify what that highest lever is going to be based on the gap we see in the student work.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll give us 2 minutes to do. Do you need some more time?
No, we're fine.
Okay, super. What'd you come up with?
So under no, I put capture the situation. So actually know what's going on in the short snippet that they have. The use of effective textual evidence, and I say effective because it has to be specific to the literary devices within the question or the devices in which they choose.
Okay.
Justification of devices, so through your analysis, this is why the author used the literary device to show X, Y, Z in the situation. And the use of multiple devices, so you can't just have a response that talks about imagery. No, you need to show me how the author uses all different literary devices to then portray the same thing. On the show procedural, what do you expect students to show? So organization in writing. So they can have a flow through transitions, which shows that, hey, this is how the author allows or guides the reader throughout the text. Accurate analysis of the story. And that's all I have for show.
So I know we chatted earlier just to try to narrow our focus, and we talked about 2 student exemplars.
Yep.
Perhaps we could narrow it down to 1.
Okay.
So we have Ms. Rogers and Ms. Patterson,
Oh, okay.
who was very happy when I told her that we were discussing her passage, by the way. Yes. So
Okay.
if we're using the chart that we just talked about,
Yep.
the things that I think that we can focus on while we're using here, and tell me if you see it a different way. The first one is just the appropriate analysis and interpretation
Okay.
of the woman's situation. And then we talked about literary devices. And then
Okay.
the third one is using adequate evidence to support
Yeah.
our
The
first
devices that they
interpretation.
chose. Yeah.
Correct.
Gotcha.
How does that sound?
Outstanding.
Anything to add or change?
No.
Okay, so let's take a look. Who do you think in your experience would be a better exemplar to start with?
Probably Rogers.
Okay, let's start with her. What did you notice?
Her introduction was okay. I just wish it was more specific when she gets to her thesis statement at the end. The second thing is that her analysis is very, very shallow, to the point where she addresses the literary devices being used, only uses one piece of evidence to support that device. Instead of giving a deeper analysis, she does that for 2. And it seemed like she ran out of time because the last part says another device that was used throughout the story is foreshadowing. So that goes into the use of multiple devices, but she glances over the use of these devices. Very, very shallow.
Agree. So at this point, we're just checking that it's a more compliance, that you can see evidence, but it's
Yep.
not the deep analysis or argument we are
Exactly.
looking for.
And when we check, I was talking about the exemplar of 1 now.
Go ahead.
So when you think about that exemplar 1, when we flip to it, what we see is that exemplar 1 there, thesis was very specific to the point where that person talks about which devices are being used, right? In order to understand the unknown and her underlying pursuit of liberation.
Right.
So that specific statement, Rogers actually says that, but she does a job of explaining that in multiple sentences instead of being specific there. Secondly, the exemplar uses approximately 2 to 3 pieces of evidence each device. This shows that, look, that person really understood what was going on through the text, and the use of literary devices in the text was apparent, and she could pull the exemplar could pull those out and then connect it back to the pursuit of liberation.
So that third part, that connection, was
Absolutely.
very apparent.
So being specific, depth of knowledge with literary devices, and then connection back to text. I think those are the things that we talked about.
Yes,
right?
sir. We're right on track.
Okay.
They can be deliberate and do it together, and you
Absolutely.
can sort them into a 1, 2, or 3, with Ms. Rogers being a 3.
Yep.
And we can see who comes close. And let's be mindful of what you just identified, which would be the specific literary devices, the evidence, and the connection to the situation.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Yep.
so now we have a handle about where we
Okay,
are.
good.
Okay, great. So now what we need to figure out, we've identified many misconceptions.
Okay.
Let's talk about what the highest misconception is, the gap between that exemplar and
Okay.
our student writing, and try to narrow down what we want to focus on.
Okay.
So it looks like if we could unpack that a little bit, what's the error or the misconception the students have, and then what does that reveal to us?
So I think the highest misconception that we have, especially in their writing, is being specific and going in depth with content.
When you say going in depth with content, can you elaborate a little bit?
Absolutely. So a lot of times they say, well, author uses literary devices to explain the situation of the character. Well, what was the specific situation that you're trying to explain? So being specific of what you want to argue, and using content to connect back to your argument.
So let's talk about using that word content. Are we using content, or are we using literary devices, or are we using textual evidence? What are we using to support the argument?
Textual evidence. So what comes from the text?
Okay, I'm going to push you a little bit more.
Okay.
Based on what this prompt is and what we're asking the kids to do we want to specify literary devices instead of evidence, or do you want to use evidence because we're talking about an argument?
Well, I think that it will be better served to do evidence, because every question on the AP exam, question 2, doesn't look like this one, to the point where certain question 2s will give you 3 specific literary devices as suggestions to look for.
Okay.
And how I teach the kids, if they give you a suggestion, I think it'll be good to look for those. Whereas this specific question doesn't give any suggestions for devices.
Understood. So it's almost like we're laying the groundwork where they need to be able to cite the evidence, and then if we needed to, we could align it to like what are some specific literary devices they could use.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, great. So let's put that in friendly language that we can refer to.
Okay.
If I was to say the highest gap that we are going to address is students need to,
I would say identify the use of literary devices.
is it literary devices or textual evidence? Let's be specific.
Okay. It will be textual evidence,
Okay.
because
So the first part that we talked about with the textual evidence, it needs to be hooked to that argument. So maybe there's 2 parts to this. Accurately state the argument
Okay.
and use textual evidence for support.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Any tweaks to it before we go ahead with the reteach?
When I think about this, we hit the 2 major points. So I accurately state the argument, identify the use of textual evidence to the argument stated. But I think we should add somewhere in there literary devices.
Okay.
But I don't know exactly where, because if we accurately state the argument and then textual evidence to connect that, the use of a literary device will kind of be in the middle, because you're using the literary device to frame the evidence that you pull. You understand what I mean?
I do, yes. So I guess there's two ways to look at this. The
Mhm.
way you just said it, you're using that literary device to first identify it as evidence
Yeah.
and then state why that's important.
Absolutely.
The other way, flip it.
Yeah.
You're identifying relevant evidence
Yeah.
and then categorizing
Oh,
what
I
literary
got you.
technique
I
it
got
is.
you. I got
Because
you.
I could say that this is a metaphor, however, it's not at all related to the prompt.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we do it in 3 steps.
So I
being-
got you. So step 1, accurately state the argument.
Yep.
Step 2, identify the use of textual evidence. Then
Mhm.
step 3 is you can connect how that evidence shows a literary device that goes back to the argument that you're trying to state.
I think that's perfect.
That's why you're awesome.
Well done. That's why you're awesome. Okay, great. We're right on track. So let's talk about what this reteach is going to look like.
Okay. I'm just taking that.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead. Take your time. Based on those two, which would you prefer to do?
Model.
Okay.
Yeah, I would.
What's your thinking behind the model?
Thinking behind the model is I can model the format of the writing, and I can model my thought process as approaching the text too. Yep.
Great. I agree with you. Okay, so let's flip. There's 2 sheets that I gave you.
Okay.
On the second one, I thought we were going to do modeling as well. So we're on the
Okay.
same page, so that's what we got.
Perfect.
Okay, so at the top, I just gave you a structure for regardless of what the skill is, this
Okay.
is how to do an effective model reteach.
I got
Okay, so just giving you some parameters here. All right, so we know what our exemplar looks like. So we're going to consider if that's what we want to see, how do we get there? Okay?
Okay.
And now what we're going to do is we're going to think about how we can show the students how to think in a way they can replicate on their own. We don't want them just to be able to think and understand how the woman is unhappy in her
Yeah.
situation only to this. We want them to think, how can they analyze the situation and cite evidence for any passage that comes in front of them.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So why don't we take, we've got about 15 minutes left. Why don't we take about 2 or 3 minutes and independently walk through what these prompts are, and then we can compare. I noticed down here they have the specific terms, dialogue, narrative, pace, and tone.
Absolutely.
So we talked about before kind of that sequencing, that would be at the end.
Yep.
But noting that you just talked about the uncontrolled emotion, norms of society.
Yep.
That's the situation?
Yes.
Okay. And then the next part would be the interplay between that emotion.
Absolutely.
All right.
So it's kind of it's a heavy lift here,
Which do you think they need to do first?
but identify. So it says consider how the 2 men confront their own uncontrolled emotions and yet attempt to abide by their social norms. So I think the first thing that they need to do is just identify that it is a connection between the 2 and classify what that connection is.
Great. So let's move on to that next section. If we're
Okay.
talking about identification, which is a lower level of Bloom's,
Mhm.
and then we're going to classify, so we're going to build on that.
Yep.
What prompts would you say? Can you think of the specific language you would use to help a model for a student how you would identify that connection?
Sure. So first I'll start with a set of rhetorical questions. So just modeling how I would go about approaching a text like this. So the first thing, if I know that I'm looking for the connection between emotions and social norms, I would say, okay, well, who's the connection between? What can I say about these connections? And kind of prompt the class to think how I would think and solicit responses for them. So it can be like almost a check for understanding.
Okay, super. Can you think of, give me a statement of the model that you would ask for the students or you would use in this exercise?
First, I would say, what's the connection between emotions and social norms? So, knowing that this excerpt comes from 1751, I would try to build a frame where the social norms in 1751 are much different from the norms in 2019. So, through that, I will already start creating a list of what was different from 1759 to now, and take my own personal perspectives outside of what the prompt's asking me to do. So I will first frame it from the standpoint of this time period, and then ask myself questions as if, Do I think that was acceptable to occur during that time period? Is this relationship, is anything important about this relationship? What stands out to me? I'll also narrate myself through annotations to model, how I can go back into the text when I start writing, so I won't have to reread everything in the text.
You've touched on we're on the right track there. So as you're actually writing those questions, think about that in a sequence of order. What are those first skills that you want the students to be able to think about, and then building on that complexity.
Perfect.
All right, great. So while you're doing this model, think aloud, what are the scholars doing?
So I would say the scholars are taking notes, not only about information that's being presented in the model, but how I approach the text in itself.
Okay.
So I guess they are learning how to then use these skills on their own. I also want them to jot down questions that they may consider when they're reading the text too, because everybody's thought process is different. So it'll be a way to show them that it's okay to take chances when they're reading. Students will also create an organized plan to model their approach to writing. So although they're receiving the model from me, what else are they doing to own their own part of thinking?
Good.
So it's kind of going twofold. Last thing, students will analyze the process to determine accurate answers to the prompt. So based on the different rhetorical questions that they ask themselves, the information that they annotate throughout the prompt, does the information that I have accurately answer what I'm being asked to do in my writing?
Okay, so now I'm thinking of what type of organizer or capture document can they use. And since we're going to be doing, I'm assuming, a lot more of these until your testing date,
Absolutely.
is there a template we can come up with where they can capture information based on the evidence of the passage, and that same framework can be replicated in the next passage you do? So you said two important things: an organized plan. So that word organized makes me think of steps, like logical, sequential steps. So when I'm analyzing a passage and you're modeling, say, here's the first thing I'm going to consider. So maybe you even use those sequence terms in your modeling.
Absolutely.
Okay, now that I've identified that, second or next.
So I'm thinking about an organizer, which I actually drew on my paper. So it'll be a 3-tier. For example, the first technique it talks here is dialogue. So my first technique is dialogue, where in the text can I jot down instances of dialogue that can then go back to the major component of emotions and social norms. So it's kind of like I'm formatting my evidence here. So when I write, all the evidence and all the information I need is in my graphic organizer.
So I think that's a great way to organize it. What I'd like to consider is knowing our kids struggle with identifying the content and identifying the situation. Do you think on the organizer it would be helpful to actually list what those terms are? Like for situation, almost defining, here's what a situation is. For context, here's what a context needs to be. So as the kids are completing that, they're having framework for what they're actually doing.
I agree.
Okay, so that organizer looks like it covered our bases of, you have the excerpt that we're going to model, you have the specific prompts of that think aloud that they can apply to anything coming, and then it's also specific to that passage.
Absolutely.
Super. The last thing I wanted to consider is, how will we know the students understand the content? That your think aloud is something that was effective and successful.
One thing I would do is, after the think aloud, after we model this specific prompt, give them just a graphic organizer and a whole new prompt that they're unfamiliar with, and have them work step by step. So before they can move on to the next part of the graphic organizer, the teacher will actually have to come around and check the student's work so they can get confirmation, okay, well, this part of the process is right, now I can move on.
What would be how would you determine if it should be individual or more peers or groups?
Well, I would think that the biggest part will be independent first, because these are skills that they need to develop on their own. And then, okay, well, if I'm struggling on section 1, then that's where pairs can come in. But in order to find out where students are struggling, they got to do their own bit of heavy lifting, so we can then match them with somebody who's pretty pretty good at those skills.
Yeah, and that might be a good way to differentiate in your class
Yeah.
as well, support each other. Okay. Any questions? Any clarification?
No, but I actually think that this is a skill that I can use for all three prompts on the AP exam. I think this is a skill that they need to know moving forward, and I think that it's pretty transparent.
So, to wrap it up, let's just model what one row of this organizer would look like. So
Absolutely.
we're on the same page. So if we're talking about your columns, what's LD?
Literary device 1
Okay.
or literary technique 1.
So the other thing I don't want to lose sight of is the situation.
Absolutely.
Our kids struggled with that situation, so maybe we have a first column about the situation,
Okay.
all right? Do you want to have almost a definition at the top of here's what a situation is, here's imagery, explanation.
Okay.
I'm just wondering how we can make this a useful resource for our scholars.
I actually think that this one is a little more usable than the one I have, because what it does is puts it in an order where I had my situation at top, you know,
Okay.
where with your graphic organizer they can actually see the progression through the different devices and evidence.
And then, for example, if you wrote, all right, so give me 3 literary devices.
So I would use imagery,
Uh-huh.
I would use tone,
Uh-huh.
and this one here asks to use dialogue. So I definitely want to use dialogue.
I know our kids like to talk. So then what I think the benefit of this could be is each one of these has to go back to the situation.
Absolutely.
So it makes the situation have to be accurate, and it makes these pieces of evidence connect back.
No, yeah, that makes sense.
So those are the two of the drivers that we identified at the beginning they struggled with.
And I actually like the way it progresses from left to right, because essentially that's how we want to model their writing. You know, you want to talk about the situation, talk about how this device is seen to then support the situation, and so on and so forth.
Great. So now we're in your classroom. You're modeling this. Think about what the demands of that prompt are.
Okay.
How would you model what you want them to say for a situation? Or is this one you're not familiar with yet? Do you want to go back to the exemplar?
So yeah, let's go back to the example.
Okay. So you're standing in front of the class, and not to put you on the spot, obviously you
Okay.
can make it better, but just to think about what's the exact language you would say to the scholars to help identify the situation.
Okay, so I would first say, okay, well, if we reread the question, right? The question identifies that the question identifies that focuses on the lives of the Bragwins, a farming family who live in a rural England land during the late 19th century. So it says, read the passage carefully, then write an essay in which you analyze how Lawrence employs literary devices to characterize a woman and capture her situation. So this question identifies that there is a specific situation that occurs in this story, right?
Yeah.
Situation in between family. So what does that situation look like, right? And how can I present that this is the specific situation that this author wants the reader to know?
Great. You just said 3 important things that I think you can use, and we talked about transferring it.
Yep.
First thing you talked about deconstructing the prompt.
Yep.
Because if they don't get the prompt right, it's going to fall apart.
Absolutely.
So making sure that they read and deconstruct the question first,
Yep.
that would be a good place to start. And then you talked about if we read the question, identifying the question captures the situation.
Yep.
So while you're reading it, you're making sure that this question is capturing. They have to identify what that situation
Exactly
is.
right. Yeah. Because you can't say, all right, well, the reader uses a literary device 1, 2, and 3 to show situation. That's in the question.
Yeah.
So now, if I'm just repeating the question, am I answering the question?
But you did a nice job, because your second question is, what does it look like?
Exactly. So that's the connection piece that we need.
There you go.
Okay.
The only thing you might want to consider for sake of differentiation is maybe like a definition box at the top.
Absolutely.
You can refer back to.
Okay.
But no, I look forward to seeing this. If you
Okay.
need a hand putting it together, you want me to take a look?
Sure.
Don't hesitate to shoot it my way.
Okay.
Then just let me know what class you think you'll be applying this to, and I would
Okay.
love to take a look.
Okay. Second block. Anytime second block, or first block. But I know, I got kids. Sometimes they come agree with me.
Second block it is.
So second block. Yeah.
All right. I look forward to it.
Okay.
As always.
Okay. Well,
Thank you for
always
your time,
welcome.
sir.
Okay.